Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Brown Girl Green. I'm Kristy and I interview environmental leaders and advocates about workplace and member diversity and inclusion in the environmental movement. Today, I have the wonderful Benji Backer on my show, and we are going to be discussing how we can bridge the political divide on climate change. So I just want to provide a little bit of context on why we're having this episode today. And as some of you may know from my first episode, I talk about I grew up in Corona, California, which is a very conservative and largely Republican city in Southern California. And I was surrounded by people that had very conservative views on politics. And then when I went to UC Berkeley, I just completely had a 360 of my life where I was surrounded by amazing liberal, democratic climate activists. But I constantly had to reconcile in my head. I would see people who just were very much like, oh, Republicans would never care about climate change. They're totally on the right. They just care about environmental destruction. I would hear a lot of that rhetoric. And I would go back home to some of my friends who identified as conservative and Republican, and they're like, no, we do care about the environment. Like, what are you talking about? Like, that's not accurate. And I found it interesting that, especially in these times, as the climate change issue has become so urgent, as we've seen with the recent IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, we only have 12 years to solve and deal with the climate crisis. And when that hit me, I started thinking about how divided we are along political lines when it comes to the climate issue. And that's really heartbreaking to me. This is an issue that impacts all of us, regardless of where you lie on the political spectrum. So in my opinion, I believe that Republicans, Democrats, people who align on all different issues along the political spectrum need to care about climate change. And so I wanted to bring Benji onto my show to discuss like how we differ, because obviously we come from different political backgrounds and understandings of how to deal with the climate issue. But I think at the end of the day, we want to come together and discuss how we can all take collective action on this issue. So I'm really excited to have him on my show today. And I just wanted to start off by having you introduce yourself, Benji, and describe who you're affiliated with, how you got interested in climate change activism, and what you're really excited about to talk about on today's show.
Yeah, so I'm really excited to be here, and it was great briefly meeting you in Berkeley. I want to say that was in April.
Yes.
So it's been a long time since then, but glad to be on finally here. And I am the president and the founder of the American Conservation Coalition, which is a 501c4 national advocacy organization that focuses on bringing more conservatives into environmental discussions by promoting environmental policies that fit within their value set. Because I think a lot of the time, and I'm sure we'll dive into this, but a lot of the time the environmental movement pushes policies that just are not cohesive with a conservative point of view. And so if that's the only side that's dominating the subject, then people on the right become disenfranchised with the environmental movement. So our organization is focused on giving conservatives a voice in this issue and bringing them in through values and policies that they can get behind. And I became really interested in this because I have been a long time outdoorsman. My family would always go to national parks when we were able to vacation, and a lot of people go to cities, but we went to national parks, and so I kind of grew up loving just the wild. And then in elementary, middle school, I was always the kid doing projects on global warming or conservation or whatever it was. So that it's been something that I've been passionate about for a very long time, including in elementary school. And then I've been a conservative activist since I was 10. So yeah, that's also been a long time. And seeing the frustration between conservatives not leading on the issue and being a conservative at the same time, and having a lot of people feel like they're left behind on the issue, that was a really telltale sign that something needed to be done, and that's where our organization came out of.
That is so cool. I love it. I think that, you are a hard person to find in the US who,
Not as hard as you think. Not as hard as you think.
who literally has really viewed these things in a holistic way, like can see beyond some of the rhetoric that gets espoused around, oh, like if you are a conservative or Republican, you need to care about X, Y, and Z values, and you can't care about climate change because that's viewed as a liberal democratic issue. It's really refreshing to hear that you have been able to see the practicality on why there needs to be action on this, especially from your own experiences as being a Republican and a young person, for that matter.
Yeah, and I think part of that is the problem has been there are certain voices on the right who say that this is a liberal issue and that we just need to not care about the environment whatsoever. Those are a very small minority of conservatives, but they're very loud. I mean, you were referencing the tweet that was responded to your original tweet about being on the show tonight, where it was just like, that same person had come at me earlier today saying that I'm a liberal because I care about the environment. So it's just that's a very small group, but they're very vocal because I actually have no idea about why they're so vocal about it. But most conservatives are truly, really dedicated to putting the environment on a pedestal. They need to put it on a higher pedestal. And the only reason that they don't, I think, is because they don't know how to promote the environment within their value set. So one quick thing here was that there's a study shown that conservatives actually in their day-to-day lives are more environmentally conscious than liberals in their day-to-day lives.
Wow.
But they don't prioritize it in elections or other things because in the day-to-day stuff like recycling, composting, energy usage reduction, all that stuff, they're a lot better because they are conscious about it. But on the larger topic of climate change or conservation or clean energy and legislation and bills, they get scared off because they don't know of how to approach that within their value set because they've only heard one side. So I think conservatives who care about the environment aren't hard to find. It's hard to find ones that aren't disenfranchised by the movement.
Wow, that's a really good point. I think that there's a lot of things that I've brought up on my show so far has been that there is a lot of this like elitist nature that comes with like being an environmentalist, like talking about what it means to even talk about carbon taxes or like cap and trade and all these like really high level amorphous like environmental policies that don't seem to grab people's attention on the ground. And I think that a lot of people are like, oh, that's just for like rich people who can go hiking on the weekends and can actually care about these things. It's not viewed as like a day-to-day thing that like does impact and like benefit or even harm all of us. So I think that's a really, really good point that the language is not of the people when it comes to climate science. That's for dang sure.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think one of the problems that the climate movement has had is now they are trying to cater to conservatives, and I will give them credit for that. I think they're trying to a certain degree, but they're trying to do it within their value set again. Like leading with a carbon tax with conservatives is not going to work. And the analogy I use is, like, if you look at conservatives, one of their main beliefs is that taxes are bad. And that level varies. I mean, obviously there are conservatives who say that taxes are necessary, but be as low as possible. And then there's conservatives that lean libertarian that say that there shouldn't be taxes at all or very, very low. It's a very wide spectrum, but that's one of the core beliefs of being a conservative is low taxes, low government. And leading with a carbon tax is completely going against their value set, especially in the front of, like, if you just say carbon tax without even going into it, then it's especially bad. So I would say that it's very similar to going up to a Democrat and telling them, oh, to support the environment, you're going to have to be pro-life. That's just going to be how it's going to have to be. That's the exact same thing as what a lot of people are doing with conservatives. To care about the environment, you're going to have to be pro-tax on this one. That's just not going to sell. And, as much as people want it to sell, it's not going to. especially in the short term. I mean, I have no idea how millennial conservatives and Generation Z conservatives are going to view taxes in 25 years. But if you're looking for a policy right now, conservatives are not going to be able to get behind a carbon tax, and that disenfranchises them even more than they already have been with the movement. They want other solutions. They want to help climate change. They want to reduce emissions, but a tax is not the best way to approach them with that.
Well, we got our first question on the board. What do you think would sell to conservatives?
A lot of things. Innovation, technology, the market. Those are ways to really foster conservative solutions on these issues. And I think what gets lost in a lot of this is the fact that the United States is reducing emissions more than anywhere in the world. And on a per capita basis, it's smaller than what it looks like on just an overall basis. But it does show that despite the lack of government regulation, we're still trending in the right direction, which then also shows that technology and innovation and companies can be part of that major solution, because that is what's causing our emissions reduction. It's the major companies, including oil companies. It's all the big companies who are attempting to reduce their emissions through new technologies and really trying to hone in on that, because A, it's good for them because it's good for PR and marketing, but B, it's also more cost effective to use clean energy and other clean technologies. So I think that's something that can really sell. And there are a lot of ways to foster that into a legislation. So that could be, some sort of incentive program that some conservatives could get behind, or a tax cut that conservatives could get behind, or even just more transparency. There's a policy today that was released by one of our partner organizations that was about how companies would be able to publish how much emissions they were reducing every year. So increase their PR goodwill, and that people would be like, oh my gosh, Microsoft is reducing so much of their emissions. I really appreciate that and want to work with them. It kind of creates more competition, who can do the most emissions reduction. It's things like that conservatives can get behind, and people will be like, oh, Benji, that's not enough. That won't curb the problem. And I mean, we're already trending in the right direction. If we continue to do things like that and employ more of what I'm talking about, I think we're going to be doing enough, and then it's going to be on China and India and other countries that are not doing enough, that we can't do it all. So they're going to have to start employing some of our technologies or a legislation or whatever that may be.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. A bill that a friend of mine brought to my attention is AB 813, which was a grid regionalization bill. And it was something that apparently press, because it's been viewed as kind of controversial, which is the whole idea that there would be a unification of the grid, where California would be implementing more renewable energy, which would overall be able to reduce the cost of renewable energy in other states. And it's this idea of we are creating more of an environment for renewable companies to be able to provide energy to more states more easily. And I'm just wondering what you feel about a policy like that. It was just something that a friend of mine brought to my attention and was like, you should bring this onto your chat. And I was like, oh, I wonder what he thinks about this.
Yeah, so I just briefly looked that up. It looks like a California piece of legislation. I hadn't seen that, so I'd have to look more into that. And but from what I see, I think what needs to happen with the state policies is a couple of things. One, there are a lot of subsidies for every energy sector, including oil and coal, that don't need it. And I personally believe that a subsidy or an incentive for a brand new technology that kind of needs to be pushed is totally great. But for something like solar and wind and others that can already compete on their own, and oil and coal, which should be able to compete on its own, should have been able to compete on its own half a century ago, those don't need to have subsidies that are actually, and that cost taxpayers because it's government money that they're not getting. So that has to be made up elsewhere. I think what needs to happen is to level the playing field for all the energy sectors. And I'll tell you a hint. I mean, clean energy and technologies would win that battle, especially moving forward. So I think that's something that people who are on the environmental left can't be scared of, is kind of putting it on a competitive playing field. And then additionally, each state has its own, grid per se, and their own utilities, and it differs state by state, but some states still regulate which energy sources are being provided for the people in the state. And I don't think that that's right, because there are a lot of cheaper, more effective sectors that aren't being utilized in some of these states. And if the market was able to compete in those states, it would drive down energy costs, but it would also propel clean energy more than it is in certain states. The states that have deregulated that have had a lot more success in lowering energy costs, and that it also has increased clean energy. So I think that both of those are probably the best ways to tackle state-by-state issues, but I'd have to take a look at that bill to know more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate your insights on that. That was great. And yeah. I also just wanted to bring up this, scaling it a little bit back. Just let's talk about climate in action, not in action, but in action. That's happening across our country today. I feel like there's this huge issue where it's hard for people, at least on the left, from my perspective, for us to feel like Republicans or conservatives could really genuinely be invested and care about climate change when we have a current administration who has pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, which is, the United States is currently the only country in the world that has pulled out of this. And while that's not going to be implemented for a few years, or on the ground, people are in debate if even the UN climate talks even matter or accomplish anything, period. The point is that last year, climate change was barely covered by the mainstream media at all. The news barely talked about it. Climate disasters were barely covered. But the one thing that was covered the most was that Donald Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement. So it was this one thing where if no one else knew anything about climate, they at least knew that the U.S. pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement. And that, in principle, is kind of pushing forward this rhetoric in some ways that, does the United States care about this issue? And while there are obviously a lot of, local and state actors that are working at their legislatures, working in their communities to really push action, and I think, the response to the U.S. pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement has been that, which has been amazing. It's still pushing forward this overall culture shift that needs to happen in a way to where our government is actively showing that they're supporting these issues. Even if on the ground the policies don't look like that, I think having that kind of rhetoric and that collective knowledge and agreement that we all care about this and are actively trying to seek things out, I think that's a huge issue that hinders policy from moving forward. I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that and what we could possibly do to start changing that narrative.
Yeah, so this is probably a place where we will definitely disagree. I actually am. So at first, I was upset that we had gone out of the Paris Accords and probably tweeted some bad things about it or whatever. But now, actually pretty shortly after, I fully kind of read through what was going on there, and I don't think the motives necessarily were in the right place at all. But I do think that it was beneficial for us to pull out. And the reason why is the reason why I was upset was because I did think that it sent a message that we didn't care and that we were the only country that didn't really care. But unfortunately, the rhetorical pro I don't think is worth the monetary con that came through being a part of that, because we were paying our way and paying for other people's climate policies and everything, hundreds of millions of dollars over a couple decades, while China and India didn't have to pay until like 2030. And so that, just going back to my initial point of that fact that the United States is reducing its emissions and China's not, there's no reason why we should be getting punished while we wait for them to start acting. There's just no reason for that to be the case. And while they were figuring out what's going on, and they're still figuring out what's going on in the Paris Accords, and I think there have been a couple more countries that have left since the United States did, it proves that that's an ineffective way to go about doing an international agreement. There are so many ways and so many different factors and reasons why we should have an international agreement on climate change. There's no doubt about it, but it needs to be done in a different way. And I think that it was very costly to the United States. It wasn't going to reduce emissions in the places that needed to cut down emissions. And although the rhetorical showcase is not good, I think that the cons outweighed the pros of staying in. And the last point I'm going to make is, again, I don't think that this administration has done enough, and that is an understatement, on climate change. They haven't done anything on climate change. But I don't think that decision was bad going forward. And I think that the administration definitely could do a lot better of prioritizing this issue. And again, I don't think I don't think President Trump did it because of the reasons I'm talking about. But at the same time, I do understand why there's a benefit in leaving, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I definitely hear your perspective. I think what's challenging for me is just that while you have brought up that like the US has made really active efforts to reduce our like emissions, and that, China, India do need to follow suit. I mean, just from what I know, at least, it seems like China has been making way more active efforts to switch to renewable energies and pushing their political rhetoric forward towards supporting like future and reducing fossil fuel emissions and dependency on fossil fuels, way more than the United States has. But that's just like from my perspective of how I've observed things. I think it is costly. I think it's costly for most developed countries to even be a part of this agreement. And I think that there is a lot to say about that, which I think we could have an entire like discussion about the Paris Climate Agreement and just international climate agreements, period, and how effective they are. But I think my perspective from just like the standpoint of like the average everyday citizen, then, like, do you think it's necessary for there to be like that mainstream rhetoric where like the everyday citizen is understanding that like their administration cares about climate change, or does that not matter as long as like the politicians are doing their job right?
Yeah, so first I'll go to the China point, and while I think on the face of it they look like they're trying to do the right thing, like they're putting up huge solar farms and stuff like that,
yeah,
it's not translating into anything, and their emissions have increased exponentially over the last few years. So in like a major way, if you look at the graph that was put together through kind of like the report of 2017 of all the emissions that were per country, they are like massively different than any other country that's increasing their emissions.
right.
And I think it's because they're trying to save face by like saying that they're doing, solar and everything like that. And I think that they probably are. I haven't been there, so I don't know how much solar they have, but people have to realize that solar and wind are not capable of powering that size of a country right now. They just aren't. And maybe in the future that'll change. But in the United States, at least, we're using nuclear and we're using hydro and we're using natural gas. and people don't like natural gas, but it's way cleaner than oil and coal. And people don't like nuclear, and that's also way cleaner. And so that's helping us reduce our emissions, in addition to using solar and wind, which are intermittent, small-scale sources, at least right now. And we're also using hydropower. I mean, you look at like Michigan and Washington State are powered almost completely by hydro, and China has a hydro kind of part of it as well, but they don't prioritize these other energy sources. And so if it's not solar and wind and maybe a little bit of hydro, it's coal and coal and coal and coal and coal and coal. And that's what it is. And so they might be shifting more to solar, but it's just not enough for what they're doing right now. So I think that's a huge issue. And then I do think it matters that we say that climate's important to us and show it within our administration. And again, that's something that I'm not particularly pleased about with the administration, but I don't think that should force us to sign an agreement that doesn't work well for us.
Okay.
It doesn't really do much on the environment, at least.
Definitely. I think another thing, as my last point that I'll bring up on this, is that I feel like the United States, like, we drive around in, like, well, I don't drive around in, but wealthier people drive around in, Priuses and Teslas, and a lot of people are praising a lot of these technologies, but especially solar panels. But it's like, where are these things being made and where are they being manufactured? And largely they're being made in developing countries outside of the United States. Like, we're not, I mean, to quote the administration that we have right now, like, a lot of people are saying that we're losing jobs to outsourcing, but it's like, we continue to outsource a lot of this production towards moving towards a renewable energy future. And so I think that while we're considering emissions and how things are distributed of resources and also just like pollution standards, we also have to address, like, well, where are we outsourcing things to? Like, it comes to like deeper questions of like how the market's currently operating, and that things are cheaper when we send it to another country, that we don't even have to like look at where the pollution's going. And the pollution has to go somewhere. These technologies have to go somewhere if we're going to transition there. But I think it does make the question a little bit more complicated and sticky when we're like pointing fingers at China and India, when we're kind of depending on them in order to like move towards a clean energy future ourselves. So.
Right. Yeah. And that is a very fair point, and something that opens up a whole new can, right?
Yeah,
like,
whole new can of worms.
How do we release our dependency, or reduce it at least, on China and the products that we get from them, and everything else that we rely on them for, money, everything. So, but I think that's a very major problem with this, and it begs the question of how we change that. But also, I think that's one thing that both sides should be getting behind, is how we can make more of our products American made. And this is a non-environmental question, but then that's a tough question when a lot of people are trying to raise the minimum wage, right? Like, like China has all those jobs for us for all of our products, because they don't pay people anything, and that's why it's cheaper. And so it's more expensive here because we have to pay our people $7.25 in most places, and that's, for most people, I think most people in this country say that that's not enough. So if you raise that, then that makes it even more complicated. I'm not saying that that's a reason not to raise the minimum wage. I'm just saying that's going to make it even more complicated. So it's a very complicated subject once you get into that. But I think China has to realize that they are the world's producer of goods right now, because, in my opinion, of their unethical, product practices. If everyone paid people a fair wage for products, then it wouldn't be an issue. But they don't. And so, and same with India, because a lot of things are made there. But that's how every other country relies on them for that. So it's not just the United States. And we need to figure out a way for that to change. But they also need to realize that that's who they are as a country. Yeah. And they are relying on us also for a lot of their economic output and input. So they also need to act on it, as long as they have our business, right? So it's a two-sided street. It's very complicated, and there's no way we're going to solve that on this.
No, I think it's good that we're talking about this, though. I love it.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. So like another thing when you're talking about like this idea of innovation and creativity, which is so desperately needed right now in the climate crisis, I'm just interested in what are some innovative and creative ways that you've kind of tested out or experimented in like your own circles of talking to like conservatives and Republicans to give them key talking points and pull them into this conversation?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I think this is another place where a lot of people can get behind the same thing. The way that I look at it is this. There are a lot of people who doubt the climate movement and the environmental movement on the right. And to their credit, sometimes I totally understand where they're coming from. And so what we need to do better at is getting into something that can click with them. And before I get into what can click with them, the answer to a lot of this is it doesn't really matter why people stand behind things that are good for the environment. We just need to like get people on board. So what I mean by that is this: clean energy is great for the economy. And so talking about how great clean energy is for the economy to a conservative is a really easy winning issue. But then people are like, oh, well, then they're not caring about the environment. You know, they're just doing it for the economy. I'm like, who cares? Like, really, who actually cares why people are behind it? If they're behind it for the economic benefit, then great. As long as they're behind it, they're behind it. They're prioritizing it with their candidates, whatever it may be. So I think that's something that's got to change. But going into stuff that's effective with conservatives, that is the main thing that we've found is clean energy. And once people realize how good it is for our economy, that's an easy sell. And how many jobs it's creating. You know, even if, let's just say, solar and coal are the same in terms of economic cheapness or whatever, in even 10 years, even if technology has kind of stagnated, the fact that solar provides so many more jobs, same with wind, hydro, nuclear, whatever, natural gas provides millions of jobs every couple of years, that is an easy argument to make. And so I think that we've got to use that more, because people are like, oh, well, you know, oil is cheaper than blank, or this is cheaper than that, and that matters, but you also have to look at how many jobs it's creating and account for how much economic productivity the jobs are causing too. So that's something that's really worked for us. And talking about kind of the climate approaches that I mentioned earlier and how to change, you know, the course of climate change through technology and innovation and clean energy, that's been really an easy sell too. We also focus on conservation a lot. So that's a whole different subject, but that's a really easy sell to conservatives and a really good lead-in topic. If you feel like someone doesn't care about the environment that much, or if they're really against climate change, and again, I understand where a lot of them are coming from. The movement, at least, a really easy way to get people to start kind of thinking about the environment more is talking about conservation, because it's just such an easy topic to talk about with both sides.
Wow, that's really insightful. I'm just really curious, like, what are these like people that are like climate deniers? Like, what is their viewpoint? Like, is it like a lack of trust? Could you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, so I think it goes back to the early 2000s, because even before that, both sides actually started to act on climate. Both presidential administrations, from H.W. Bush to Clinton to Reagan to really everybody since like the early 1980s, when this became a bigger discussion. So Nixon and Carter too. The issue has been, it's been so politicized by the left, and it's been such an alarmist movement. So in the 80s and 90s, people were being told that if we didn't curb climate change, the world was going to end by 2000. And then it didn't, and nothing changed really. And then now we're being told in 2018 that we've got 12 years, and maybe that's true, right? Like, that could be true, and I'm worried about climate change. But that's why people are skeptical, because like, I've heard this before. I've heard that the world's going to end in 12 years, like 4 times in my life. And I'm still here and my family's still thriving and nothing's really changed. And so it's going to be really hard to sell people who have seen that and also are told that, like, people don't like to be told what to do. And unless you deeply care about the environment like you or I do, you're not going to change your, like, course of your life to curb a theory that people may or may not believe in. Like, if you're telling people, like the climate movement often does, that you have to, like, drive an electric car or just bike to work, or if you don't do X, then the world's going to end by 2030. They don't like that. That's, like, really agitating to people. It's got to be more of like we have some work to do and you can be a part of this. And, like, it's just been such an alarmist movement, and one that's so intrusive on people's lives that they get turned away. And because they get turned away and the conservatives don't really have an answer of our own, which is something that we're working on, then it's like, okay, well, then I'm just going to jump to the other side of it. Then I'm just going to say that it doesn't exist and that it's not an issue. And that's where it comes from. But I think also people then assume that because some people don't like the climate change discussion, that they don't care about the environment at all. And again, that goes back to our first kind of question, that's also not true, but that frustrates people even more. And it's just kind of like this endless cycle. But it changed when Al Gore kind of came forward in the early 2000s. And climate change is, I think it's a pressing issue, but people are skeptical of that because of everything I just explained.
Wow. That's really good to know. I haven't heard that perspective yet. I think I've heard a lot of, like, oh, it's invented as a hoax to steal jobs. And I mean, that was what the person on Twitter just said earlier.
Well, and people say that because of how skeptical they are. And then, there are groups and people who espouse that kind of language, and then because they're skeptical, they believe that instead.
And I mean, it's real. Like, I mean, the coal industry is dying in the US. And I mean, that was a huge thing that a lot of people had a lot of emotional investment in, especially people who are, like, on the right, who come from coal country. And I'm just wondering, like, if you've given talks at all in coal country, or if you've had any experience of gently bringing the discussion of, like, transitioning to renewable energy and, like, what that looks like in terms of, like, making people feel like their identity is not attached to, like, this one type of income, that they can evolve with a changing economy.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I'd say that they're the hardest people to sell on this for sure. And again, rightfully so, because when they get approached by this, they see it as an attack on their job, right? Yeah. And that's their livelihoods. And no matter how much you hate or love coal, that's what pays the bills and keeps their families food on the table. And people can't forget that. The dying coal industry is bad for those families. And so anything that threatens that is really scary. It's like, any other job industry that's been threatened through the years. So I think, and even if it's going out on its own, it's still threatening, right? Like, it's still scary for these people to know that maybe in 10 years they won't have that job, or that if their kids, are going to have that job, they can't. So I think that what needs to happen is people have to lead from the fact that, like, there's alternatives out there. And you have to create a plan for these people who are worried about it. And if the coal industry were to die out, you would have to create a plan for those people to get on their feet and get another job. You have to provide certainty. And so I don't think you're ever going to convince somebody who's really immersed in the coal industry to get on board with climate change reform. Again, it's kind of like the carbon tax argument, but on a much broader issue with climate change. That is their family's core values. And that's what they are invested in. And as much as you want to tell people, as much as the environmentalist wants to tell people that, that the coal industry is bad and it's bad for health and for the emissions and it's not cheap anymore or whatever, that's who they are. And they're going to believe what they are invested in, and that's the coal industry. So it's really hard to work with them on the climate change issue. But again, you have to understand where they're coming from.
Yeah.
and maybe just say, okay, that's not a community that we're going to try to sell on climate change, but we also are going to take into account them when we're making these decisions.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And I think that that's something that gets left out a lot of this, like pushing for renewable energy and just like pushing that forward. In a way, it could ring a lot of alarms for a lot of those communities. And I think we can't forget about them either. And, you know, there's a lot of this discussion, at least in the environmental activist world, of a just transition and constantly thinking through like, how can we, you know, practice what we preach and not just like leave communities on the sidelines when we do shift to a sustainable future. And I think that's really important.
Right.
Yeah.
So I have a question though, for you.
Yeah.
So something that I had thought about before coming on, and now that you kind of have a better perspective of like where some of these communities are coming from, if conservatives like act on climate change, like me, for example, but then also don't get the support from the left, you know, like when we take our approach to, actually, I'll give a really good example. In Washington State, they tried to pass a revenue-neutral carbon tax. In 2016, which for people who are watching this, that is basically a carbon tax that is, instead of the state getting the tax money, it's invested back into taxpayers' pockets. So people on the right here, because the right in Washington State is a little bit more moderate because of how far left the left is. So like, especially like the urban Republicans tend to be moderate. They were for it completely. All of the Republican former governors and senators and stuff all endorsed it. And they broke it down by population, and overwhelmingly Republicans actually voted for that legislation on the state, because it was a state initiative on the ballot. And it lost because the Democrats didn't like where the money went. And so that left a lot of Republicans and conservatives thinking, okay, I've gone this far. I've embraced a carbon tax, and I won't even get the support because the Democrats are worried about where the money goes. So like, if they really care about the environment, they take okay, we got them. We got Republicans to show that they can be behind a carbon tax. We're going to pass this, and maybe that's not where we want it to go, but at least it curbs the environmental problems that we want to face. It doesn't help the schools because that's where they want the money to go, but at least it helps the environment. So my question is, if conservatives care about the environment, and maybe they're for carbon tax, or maybe they're like me who doesn't think that that's necessarily the best approach, but if people like us care, but we don't get the support from the left, how do you think like real change will occur on the topic, either on a state basis or federal basis?
I guess I have a question, because I don't think I've heard about this yet. Where did the money go in that situation, or where was the money going to go?
The money was going to go back to the taxpayers.
Okay.
That was the whole point. That's why conservatives were behind it here, because they're like, okay, yes, it's a tax, but at least the money's being distributed back to taxpayers. So essentially they're paying less taxes.
But then Democrats wanted it to go to schools.
Go to schools, or like, there's one on the that's what their argument was, like that schools and roads and other infrastructure needed it.
Okay.
This year, there's one on the ballot that the money goes back to like clean energy companies and stuff like that to improve. But Republicans are totally against that one this year. But yeah, for 2016, it was as Republicans, people wanted the money to go back to the taxpayers' pockets, and the Democrats voted no because they wanted it to go to other government programs.
Interesting. That's difficult, because I'm like, I guess from my own biases, and maybe I need to investigate this for myself, like I would like to understand more like where they were coming from on being against that, because I just feel like, I don't know, I'm unsure, because I would have to know like if it were going to certain taxpayers, if like they were worried that like it would go into the pockets of certain people that didn't deserve to get that tax incentive.
I think it's distributed evenly among, and again, I don't expect you to know this, but I guess like the overarching question is like,
the overarching question is, in a situation like that, when we got so close, but the outcome was like that close off, why did it matter so much if it was going to achieve this like outcome?
And why should conservatives act on this issue if they're not going to get supported with their beliefs, right?
Yeah. And honestly, I feel like this leads into a bigger question for me, which like I know you probably want more specifics, but it leads a bigger question to me where I just think that there's not enough people on both sides like having more thorough debates about these things. Like you said, like the fact that like this was able to happen in Washington speaks volumes to the kind of political atmosphere that exists in Washington. I know that here in California, we just recently passed SB 100, which was like a really big deal because it was like, oh, we're really going to like switch to fully renewable energy, but like on a very small percentage of like our energy outputs of like where we're releasing emissions. But it was still like, oh, it was a bipartisan, people were acting on it together. Like it was a big win in the environmental movement. And although like there were a lot of groups who weren't exactly pleased with it, it still made it all the way to the finish line to where it's like being considered. And I think like, again, that's California and Washington, some of the most progressive places in the entire United States.
Yep.
And I think that, in my opinion, we can only know how liberals are going to support conservatives on those issues if we're having more conversations like this, where we can have more of a collective vision on how we want to get from one place to another. Because I feel like on issues like healthcare and more controversial issues in some way or another, where we understand, at least the liberal side understands the conservative side on like how they want to get from X to Z. I think like it's this thing where on climate and environmental issues, at least from what I've seen, it's kind of unclear exactly like how conservatives who actually like do believe in climate change even want to take action on it. Because I think the common assumption is that conservatives and Republicans don't even want to care about community well-being or whatever when it comes to environmental issues.
Yeah.
That's a deep-seated feeling that liberals feel on the left. And that means that like there's a issue at stake for conservatives where they need to in some ways like also build out rhetoric, not necessarily to convince the left, but in some ways to be like, oh, you can trust us that our process and how we want this outcome to come out, like this is why it matters to us. Like, can we try to figure out and debate a compromise of that outcome so that way we're not just totally scrapping the whole thing and ruining this bipartisan support. So that's just my opinion. There needs to be more conversation to even understand what the conservative stance or belief is on how we can achieve environmental transition. And I don't even think that that's really out there in the mainstream at all.
Yeah, so I need to head out soon, but I do want to address that. And I think you made a really good point. Conservatives need to do a far better job of conveying how they feel about this in a proactive way instead of like a defensive,
exactly,
you're all wrong type of way. Something that we always try to say is that like conservatives, we need to stop being against everything on the environmental left. We need to start being for something and say, okay, yep, we don't agree with this, but we're excited about blank. So that's something that's got to change, and there definitely have to be more discussions like this because people need to be able to compromise like they could have in 2016, and people need to be able to compromise on their beliefs just at least to get some things done. Doesn't have to be on everything. But you shouldn't have to say, okay, this is 2017, 2018, Republicans are in power. We aren't going to get anything done until we take the House back in 20. You shouldn't have to say that. You should be like, okay, all right, we've got some different viewpoints, but there's this great bill on the docket that I think that we could pass with both chambers and both sides being on board. I think it's a sad state that we've gotten to that the Democrats and the Republicans are so radical on the fringes of both sides that nothing can be done in the middle, especially on a topic like this. And again, I think it starts with Republicans expressing their viewpoints better on climate, and Democrats being willing to accept that, okay, Republicans actually do care about the environment, but they might have a different approach, and let's work with them on that. That's where the conversation needs to go.
Yeah, 100%. And I can't believe this hour zoomed by. I'm like so into this conversation. Would love to have you back in the future.
Thank you.
Really appreciate your viewpoints. And how can people stay in touch with you or learn more about the work that you're doing?
Yeah, well, my Twitter is @Benji Backer, and our website's acc.eco. So instead of .com, it's .eco. And just sign up for our email list or follow me or us on Twitter @ACC_national. I will say that I really appreciate what you're doing, because we need more fair, independent voices on both sides of the aisle. And, I'm sure if we talked for longer, we'd find other places where we disagree, but there's been conversations. There need to be a lot more conversations like we're having, and I'm glad that you're focusing on that. So thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for joining another episode of Brown Girl Green. My name's Kristy Drutman, and I interview environmental leaders and advocates about workplace and member diversity and inclusion in the environmental movement. Thank you so much for joining us, Benji.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Brown Girl Green. This is Kristy Drutman, and I interview environmental leaders and advocates about workplace and member diversity and inclusion. I'm working to change the image of what it means to be an environmentalist in the 21st century. Be sure to subscribe to my Crowdcast channel, crowdcast.io/Brown Girl Green, my YouTube channel, Brown Girl Green, and my social media is @BrownGirl_Green. You can also check out my website, www.kristydrutman.com. Catch you on my next episode. Thanks.